We're back. Now let's put Canada's mining industry on the map. 60% of the world's exploration companies are listed on Canada's stock exchanges. 85% of the world's mining deals are done in Canada. Canadian companies account for over 40% of global exploration budgets. And they have interests in more than 3,000 mineral properties in more than 100 countries. In mining, Canada is a big player. As commodity prices boom around the world, Canada's mining industry is booming too. It's also under increasing scrutiny. Recent pressure from NGOs led to a national roundtable on corporate social responsibility and the extractive industry. It produced a stellar and unanimous report. NGOs and industry came to a consensus. We wanted to talk to someone from Foreign Affairs about these new guidelines. Unfortunately, they declined, saying they're still studying the proposals. Seems there may not be consensus in the Canadian government. But for the bigger picture of the Canadian mining industry worldwide, we're joined now by Karyn Keenan with the Halifax Initiative, a development NGO based in Ottawa. Karyn, welcome to On the Map.
Thank you.
Now, this National Roundtable on Corporate Social Responsibility still hasn't had its recommendations accepted by the government. In the absence of that report, what rules actually apply to Canadian mining companies who are doing business overseas right now?
When a Canadian mining company invests in a foreign country, it's the legislation of that foreign country that applies to the company. But unfortunately, what's happened is that beginning in the early 90s, there was a major push by institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for mineral-rich developing countries to radically reform their legislation governing mining operations in order to make their countries more attractive to foreign investors.
This is a story we've heard many, many times.
Yes.
So what does it mean to the actual rules under which Canadian companies operate?
It means that usually there's a very permissive regulatory environment in which they operate. Environmental and social safeguards are very weak, and often it's also the case as well that the government has a very weak capacity to enforce the poor regulations that often do exist.
So we heard earlier in tonight's show from a representative of Sky Resources who tells us that they're following the Equator Principles, and there are a host of sort of voluntary codes of conduct around the world. What are those principles?
The Equator Principles are, it's a code, a set of standards that's being adopted by a number of private banks, but they're based on World Bank standards. Unfortunately, the standards have some weaknesses that are of concern in key areas like human rights. They also don't ensure that communities and populations that are impacted by operations like mining operations are effective participants in decision-making processes around those projects.
Let's talk a little bit more about Guatemala specifically. There's more than just Sky Resources obviously involved in that country. What has the Canadian government's role been in relationship to mining in Guatemala in recent years?
Well, Guatemala has really been opened up to mining investment, like so many of these other lesser developed countries, and it was the World Bank that had a very instrumental role in that. But it's always important to remember that Canada has power within the World Bank. We have a seat on the board of directors, and it's the board that makes ultimate decisions about which projects get approved. And so we can be doing more within the World Bank to ensure that those projects that are supported are environmentally and socially sustainable.
So beyond the World Bank, what other mechanisms does the Canadian government use to assist corporations with foreign investments?
There are a number of ways that the Canadian government supports those investments. One is through Export Development Canada, which is a Crown corporation that's mandated to promote Canadian exports and overseas investments, and they directly support mining projects by providing loans and insurance. In 2006, they had a $2 billion exposure in the mining and infrastructure sector, so it's significant quantities of money. The Canadian International Development Agency is also active in supporting these investments, particularly in Africa, through a fund that was established quite recently. Again, they're a direct equity supporter of those projects. And the Canadian Pension Plan.
That's our international foreign aid being used to support Canadian corporations in poor countries.
That's right. It's overseas development aid that's being used to support our private sector.
Now, the National Roundtable on Corporate Social Responsibility process, it hasn't been approved. It's not in effect. But it was a unanimous consensus document among NGOs and industry. Your signature's on it, as a matter of fact, as I look at it. How do we avoid the fate suffered by so many other reports of this kind to be a nice set of voluntary guidelines for the industry to sit on a shelf, to be invoked and referred to, but never really be enforced?
there will be reporting obligations, and there will be the beginnings of an effective enforcement mechanism. And what I'm talking about there is something that's very innovative and interesting, and that's an ombudsman that would receive complaints from communities or nonprofit organizations that work with those communities that are affected by Canadian mining operations. And that ombudsman would do independent fact-finding about the operations and would make a conclusion about whether the company is in compliance or not with the standard set that we've developed. Now, you're right, those standards are not legally binding, and even if the ombudsperson makes a finding that the company is not in compliance, there aren't many sanctioning mechanisms, apart from the one that we recommended, which is that if a company is in non-compliance, the Canadian government shouldn't be supporting that company.
Karyn, Keenan, thanks for being on the map.
You're welcome.
The United Nations says there's nearly 10 million refugees worldwide. When we come back, why that number needs revisiting.